Studio Go presents Genius Insight, Commitment and Consistency with Dr. Milan Lebray. Get it in writing. At some point, we may have all used this expression. Although a seemingly simple and logical concept, it effectively captures some of the principles outlined in the material we will cover. But what exactly does this mean in terms of commitment? In a nutshell, according to the experts, commitments that are made more actively have more staying power than those that are made passively. Simply put, we tend to judge ourselves based on what we did rather than what we didn't do. This is yet another example of the power of influence. This becomes even more apparent in your daily life because the rules of good manners push you to say yes whenever possible. In fact, the following are some fundamental rules of the basic human condition. 1. We're all taught to agree. Number 2. When we agree, we feel a sense of commitment to follow through. 3. Once committed, we will automatically start to justify the commitment. 4. We will maintain the commitment to appear consistent. 5. Through any new set of consistent behaviors, we often change our self-image. 6. A changed self-image can lead to a number of behaviors unrelated to our original agreement. 7. Now, when presented with a new request, we are even more likely to agree. And thus begins the unavoidable cycle of commitment and consistency, which leads us into another episode of Genius Insight. The truth is, no one wants to be perceived as fickle. Once we make a choice or take a stand about something, we will encounter and endure personal and interpersonal pressure to behave consistently with that commitment. Why? Because commitment is socially valued, adaptive, and increases predictability. That said, commitment as a standalone concept is not particularly problematic, but challenges come into play when we rely on something called click-whirr. Click-whirr is the tendency to react automatically to a piece of information in a situation rather than thoroughly analyzing it before we respond. An example, a handshake. When someone gives you their hand, you automatically respond by raising your hand to meet theirs. However, when we fail to think things through, this type of blind consistency can lead us to behave illogically because we rely on automatic processing, which utilizes our own actions and principles to dictate future behavior. But sometimes it isn't all that bad. When we aren't walking blindly through the world, we may find ourselves engaging in fundamental attribution errors. What does this mean, you may wonder? Well, it means we expect others to have a certain level of consistency and compliance. Attribution error is when we underemphasize situational or environmental issues to explain a person's behavior, while overemphasizing the dispositional or personality-based explanation. In essence, we believe that what people do reflects who they are. Sometimes this leads to cutting yourself a break while holding others 100% accountable for their actions. Here's an example. Have you ever chastised someone for being late to a meeting? Then you proceed to make a bunch of excuses for being late yourself that same day? If you've ever done this, you've made a fundamental attribution error. The fundamental attribution error exists because of how people perceive the world. While you have at least some idea of your character, motivations, and situational factors that affect your day-to-day, you rarely know everything that's going on with someone else. But then again, most of us don't like being judged or even being late for all that matter. And as humans, we are driven by internal and external pressures to be consistent. So how do we meet this need? One way we do this is through something called cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance is a psychological discomfort experienced when there is any inconsistency between our attitude or behavior. Cognitive dissonance can make people feel uneasy and uncomfortable, particularly if the disparity between their beliefs and behaviors involves something central to their sense of self. To relieve this discomfort, people may explain things away or reject information that conflicts with their existing beliefs. Unresolved, the discomfort can manifest itself in a variety of ways. People may feel anxiety, embarrassment, regret, sadness, shame, or stress. This can all lead to negative feelings of self-worth. Here's an example of cognitive dissonance. When people smoke, the behavior, and they know that the smoking causes cancer, the cognition, they are in a state of cognitive dissonance. But then you may ask, well, if that's the case, why do people keep smoking? Well, as it turns out, a person might decide that they enjoy smoking, then they value their health. They believe that the behavior is worth it in terms of risk versus rewards. So, how do we change and increase compliance within ourselves and others? Research has clearly shown us that if we want to improve compliance, we have to enhance the strength of the commitment. The power of the commitment principle depends on several factors, such as our level of choice, the visibility of our commitment, the behavior involved, the size of the initial request, and the impact it has on our self-image. But there is also one other important aspect to all of this. We also need to look at what our level of responsibility is regarding that change. So we have to ask ourselves, will my current attitude lead to that desired behavior? And how do my current behaviors shape my perspective? More on these questions a bit later. From there, we have to discern whether or not we will engage in active commitment or a state of passive commitment. In an active commitment, we often take steps to confirm our position. However, in the case of passive commitments, our failure to uncommit tends to leave us committed. In either case, there is some sense of commitment. However, active commitment tends to lead to a stronger feeling of obligation and ultimately more success. When we examine the power of behavior, we must assess our actions to indicate what we are committed to. Our behaviors are visible to observers and therefore provide physical evidence of our position. Because behaviors are external signs of our commitment, they are much harder to discount or remove. We are also more likely to believe someone's behavior rather than their words. The old saying, actions speak louder than words, is quite accurate with regard to social influence. So now circling back to how our attitudes lead to behavior. When examining the relative power of public versus private commitments, one might ask, are we more likely to keep promises to ourselves or strangers? Again, research shows a definite pattern of behavior. Research indicates that the power of the public eye is much greater than any self-imposed pressure. We have an overriding desire to appear consistent to others, so much so that our desire to be consistent supersedes our desire to be accurate. So how do our initial efforts influence our commitment? The power of our effort tells us that the more energy we put into a specific behavior, the more self-justification we have to provide for that effort. Self-justification leads to a change in values, attitudes, and feelings. Let's use the practice of hazing as an example. Hazing has been somewhat controversial, but the value of hazing stems from the justification that a certain amount of effort and public commitment is necessary to join the group. So as you can imagine, there are some dangers in all of this. Plus, there's a caveat. One of the key findings of research on cognitive dissonance is that the behavior must be voluntary. In other words, a person cannot have a logical, reasonable excuse for their behavior beyond a change in their belief. Why is voluntary commitment so crucial for change? The power of volunteering is vital because, 1, there is a need to ensure that there are no alternative explanations for the behavior. 2, people must rely on their own choice to produce self-justifications. 3, if we have external pressure, it's more likely that our behaviors will revert back in the absence of the external justification. But the most significant danger with commitment and consistency is that sometimes even agreeing to a small request can lead to a change in our self-image and self-worth. This can lead to changing our future behaviors to match the newly formed self-image. As such, there is both internal and external pressure to maintain the new attitude or behavior. People have an internal pressure to have their actions and behavior be consistent. Then there's an external pressure to appear consistent to others. These simultaneous pressures can make change relatively easy to produce and also very resistant to change. But of course, this can also lead to something positive if the modification is good for us. So to wrap up here, you've learned that many variables need to be considered when we are engaged in the process of commitment and consistency. But at the core, we have to want to make the changes. That decision also needs to be in complete alignment with our thoughts, words, and actions, and possibly even made public for it to stick. That's why commitment and consistency aren't always easy. If it were, everyone would be a change master. What do you need to change in your life? Do you feel ready to take it on now? I mean, no pressure or anything.
Let's review. Get it in writing. Commitments that are made more actively have more staying power than those that are made passively. Commitment is 1, socially valued, 2, adaptive, and 3, increases predictability. Click whirr is the tendency to react automatically to a piece of information in a situation, then thoroughly analyze it before we respond. Volunteering is vital. Why? Well, 1, there is a need to ensure there is no alternative explanation for the behavior. 2, people must rely on their own choice to make self-justifications. 3, it's more likely that our behavior will revert back in the absence of the external justification. Attribution error. When we underemphasize situational or environmental issues to explain a person's behavior while overemphasizing the dispositional or personality-based explanations. Cognitive dissonance. A psychological discomfort experienced when there is any inconsistency between an attitude and behavior. Active versus passive commitment. In active commitment, we often take steps to confirm our position. In passive, our failure to uncommit leaves us committed. That's all. Thank you for joining me again on Genius Insight. We'll see you next time.